Divine massacre. When love turned to genocide. The smiling animals boarding Noah's wooden vessel hide history's most disturbing truth. A creator who drowned countless innocent children, exterminated entire civilizations, and orchestrated the most comprehensive mass extinction in religious history. What kind of God drowns babies? What moral lesson involves the systematic elimination of nearly every living creature? The cheerful Sunday school tale masks a horror story of biblical proportions. Imagine the screams. Millions of voices crying out as waters rose without mercy. Parents desperately holding children above surging floodwaters until exhaustion claimed them both. Entire communities clinging to rooftops and hillsides, praying to the very deity who had condemned them. The elderly, the infants, the disabled. None spared in this indiscriminate deluge. According to the biblical account, God watched as his creation gasped their final breaths. Bodies floating alongside the animal kingdom he had once proclaimed good. This wasn't a surgical strike against only the wicked. This was total annihilation, a divine reset button pressed with full awareness of its consequences. The flood narrative presents us with perhaps the most disturbing moral contradiction in religious literature. A God described as loving, merciful, and just who simultaneously committed an act that, if performed by any human leader, would constitute the greatest genocide in history. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. We're asked to reconcile the God who so loved the world with one who once drowned it. What does this tell us about divine morality? If God's ways are meant to guide human ethics, what lesson are we to draw from this wholesale slaughter? That mass punishment is sometimes necessary? That collective guilt justifies collective death? The theological implications are profoundly troubling. Some defenders argue that humanity had become universally corrupt, that every single person outside Noah's family deserved death. But this creates an even more disturbing implication, that even children were so irredeemably evil that drowning was their just fate. Can an infant be evil? Can a toddler be beyond redemption? The text offers no exceptions for the young, no divine rescue of the innocent. Others suggest the flood represents God's profound grief rather than wrath, that destruction came from divine heartbreak over human corruption. Yet this anthropomorphic explanation only deepens the moral quandary. Would a parent, no matter how disappointed, drown their children? Would grief ever justify genocide? The flood story forces uncomfortable questions about divine proportionality. If humans were violent, why respond with greater violence? If humans were immoral, why answer with an act that, by human standards, would be considered the height of immorality? The contradiction creates a dangerous precedent, that overwhelming force is the appropriate response to wickedness. Perhaps most disturbing is what the flood reveals about divine regret. Genesis explicitly states that the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. This introduces a theologically problematic concept, a supposedly omniscient deity who experiences regret. Did God not foresee humanity's corruption? Did the creator of time itself fail to anticipate the future of his creation? Either God lacks foresight, challenging divine omniscience, or the destruction was always part of the plan, raising even more troubling questions about divine intention. The narrative's moral center, Noah, presents additional ethical problems. Described as righteous in his generation, Noah never questions the divine plan. He builds his ark in silent complicity, apparently unmoved by the fate awaiting his neighbors. He never argues for mercy, never negotiates for others' lives, never questions the drowning of children. Unlike Abraham, who bargained for Sodom and Gomorrah, Noah accepts global destruction without protest. Is this truly the model of righteousness, unquestioning acceptance of others' doom? After the waters recede, God establishes a covenant never again to destroy all life by flood, an implicit acknowledgement that perhaps the punishment was excessive. The rainbow becomes not just a symbol of promise but a divine reminder of restraint, as if even God recognized the need for limits on divine wrath. This post-flood covenant suggests a fundamental shift in divine approach, from destruction to preservation, from collective punishment to individual judgment. Yet the psychological trauma remains. How did Noah's family process their survival? What does it mean to be the chosen remnant of a drowned world? What kind of deity commands you to listen to the desperate cries of your drowning neighbors while floating safely above? The text offers no insight into their psychological state, no mention of survivors' guilt, no processing of trauma, no questioning of why they alone deserved life. This narrative doesn't just challenge our understanding of divine justice, it fundamentally reshapes it. It suggests that at certain thresholds of human wickedness, total destruction becomes morally acceptable. It implies that collective punishment, including the death of the innocent, can be divinely sanctioned. It presents complicity with mass death as righteousness. For modern readers, the flood story presents an unavoidable moral crisis. Either we accept that divine morality operates on entirely different principles than human ethics, making God's example ultimately unsuitable for human emulation, or we must confront the possibility that this ancient narrative reflects not divine truth but human attempts to explain natural disasters through the lens of divine judgment. Perhaps the most challenging question is this: if we wouldn't accept this behavior from any human authority, should we accept it from a divine one? Does might make right even when the might is supernatural? Does creator status confer the right to destroy without moral constraint? The flood remains religious literature's most troubling moral parable. A story that, taken at face value, normalizes extinction-level violence as an appropriate response to human corruption. It demands either moral gymnastics to justify or the courage to question whether ancient understandings of divine justice should inform our modern moral compass. The biblical flood isn't an isolated story. It's part of a haunting pattern that spans continents and civilizations, suggesting either a shared historical catastrophe or a collective psychological need to process existential terror through divine judgment narratives. The Epic of Gilgamesh, predating Genesis by centuries, tells of Utnapishtim, who built a massive ship when warned by Ea about the gods' plan to flood the world. The Mesopotamian gods, disturbed by human noise, voted to eliminate humanity, until one deity leaked the plan. Sound familiar? This Babylonian account includes details strikingly similar to Noah's story: 7 days of flood, releasing birds to find land, and a divine promise never to destroy humanity again. The parallels are too specific for coincidence. In ancient Greece, Zeus flooded the world to end the Bronze Age when humanity became morally corrupt. Only Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survived by building a chest. In Hindu mythology, Manu was warned by a fish, an avatar of Vishnu, about an impending deluge and instructed to build a ship. Chinese mythology speaks of a great flood survived by Fuxi and his sister Nuwa. The Mayan Popol Vuh describes a flood sent by the god Huracan to destroy the wooden people he had created. From Australia to the Americas, from Africa to Asia, flood myths appear in over 300 different cultures. This universality demands explanation. If these stories were merely regional responses to local floods, why do they share such specific elements? Why does the divine punishment/human survival template repeat across unconnected civilizations? One disturbing possibility is that these myths encode actual trauma. Perhaps the rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, approximately 14,000 to 11,500 years ago, when coastal communities worldwide would have experienced catastrophic flooding as glaciers melted. Imagine the terror of watching your entire homeland disappear beneath rising waters over a single generation. Without scientific understanding, survivors would naturally interpret such catastrophes as divine judgment. Another possibility is that these parallel myths reveal something fundamental about human psychology: our need to explain natural disasters through moral frameworks. The flood becomes not just water but judgment. Survival becomes not luck but divine selection. This pattern suggests a universal human tendency to seek meaning in suffering, to transform geological events into moral narratives. The most troubling implication of these parallel myths is what they reveal about ancient conceptions of divinity across cultures. Nearly universally, gods are portrayed as willing to commit genocide, easily provoked to violence, and possessing moral standards wildly at odds with human ethics. The flood myths collectively paint a disturbing portrait of divine human relations. Creators who regret their creation, deities who solve problems through mass destruction, and gods whose tolerance for human behavior is frighteningly limited. More disturbing still is the moral message encoded in these parallel myths. Repeatedly, we see that divine favor is arbitrary, that salvation is reserved for a chosen few, and that the majority of humanity is expendable. The survival of a single family, whether Noah's, Utnapishtim's, or Manu's, normalizes the concept of an elect minority whose lives matter more than the drowning masses. This narrative of special selection has fueled dangerous ideologies throughout history, as groups claim to be the metaphorical descendants of Noah, the righteous remnant in a world deserving destruction. The universality of flood myths also challenges religious exceptionalism. If the biblical flood account shares fundamental elements with hundreds of other cultural traditions, what does this say about claims of unique divine revelation? Was God also speaking to the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Hindus, and the Maya? Or are all these stories, including the biblical version, human attempts to process trauma and explain natural catastrophes through the lens of divine intent? Perhaps most significantly, these parallel myths reveal how universal the fear of divine eradication truly is. Across cultures and time periods, humans have lived with the terrifying belief that their creators might choose to uncreate them, that divine love is conditional, and that extinction-level events reflect divine will rather than natural processes. This shared psychological burden, the fear that the gods might drown us all, appears to be a cross-cultural inheritance, a shadow that has haunted human consciousness across millennia. The flood myths collectively form a disturbing mosaic of divine-human relations, one where gods create imperfectly, regret deeply, and destroy indiscriminately. They reveal ancient humanity's profound insecurity in its relationship with the divine, a terror that cosmic forces might, at any moment, choose to wash away human existence. When we teach children cheerful songs about animals marching 2 by 2 onto Noah's Ark, we sanitize not just one culture's trauma narrative, but a universal human nightmare about divine abandonment and mass extinction. The most psychologically devastating aspect of the flood narrative isn't the water itself. It's what happens after. When the waters recede and Noah steps onto mud still soaked with the remains of civilization, we confront the true horror, living with the knowledge you were spared while others perished. What does it mean to be the chosen survivors of an apocalypse? What responsibility comes with being the seed of a second-chance humanity? The flood story isn't just about destruction. It's about the unbearable burden of being deemed worthy to continue when others were not. Imagine Noah's first night on dry land. As his family sleeps, he stands alone under stars that once watched over millions, now witnessing only 8. Every footstep crosses ground that is both grave and cradle, a mass burial site that will birth a new world. The psychological weight is staggering. Did he hear phantom screams in the wind? Did his dreams fill with faces of neighbors who begged for room on his ark? Did he question why he alone was righteous enough to survive? The text offers no insight into Noah's mental state, a telling omission that sanitizes the psychological horror of being the sole survivors of divine genocide. This narrative creates a devastating theological inheritance, the concept that survival equals divine favor. Throughout history, this dangerous idea has been weaponized by the fortunate to justify their fortune. Those who thrive in systems of inequality can point to Noah and declare their prosperity evidence of righteousness. Those who suffer can be dismissed as deserving their fate, modern versions of the drowned masses. This theology of survival creates a moral framework where success indicates divine blessing rather than systemic advantage, a perspective that has justified countless atrocities throughout human history. Even more disturbing is what the flood reveals about divine expectation. After wiping the slate nearly clean, what does God require of the survivors? Surprisingly little. Noah's first act after disembarking is to build an altar and make burnt offerings, continuing the same sacrificial practices that existed before the flood. Despite this cosmic reset, no new moral code emerges. No elevated expectations appear. The rituals remain unchanged. If the flood was meant as correction, what exactly was corrected? The narrative suggests a troubling possibility, that the destruction wasn't about improving humanity but simply expressing divine displeasure. The post-flood covenant represents another psychological burden. God promises never again to destroy all life by flood, placing a rainbow as reminder. But this promise contains an implicit threat. God could still destroy humanity by other means. The rainbow becomes not just a symbol of promise but a trigger for existential anxiety. A celestial reminder that divine genocide remains in the toolkit, just not by water next time. What kind of psychological security can humanity build under such conditions? What does it mean to worship a deity who needs a visual reminder not to eradicate his creation again? Perhaps most disturbing is the flood's impact on human moral agency. If divine judgment can come so absolutely and arbitrarily, what framework exists for ethical development? If righteousness is defined not by clear moral principles but by inscrutable divine selection, how can humans know how to live? Noah was never told why he alone was righteous, leaving future generations without a clear ethical roadmap. Only the knowledge that divine destruction could return if some invisible line is crossed. This legacy extends into our modern environmental crisis. As climate change threatens coastal communities worldwide, the flood narrative takes on disturbing new relevance. Are today's rising seas divine judgment or human-caused disaster? The biblical framework encourages a fatalistic acceptance. If God promised no more divine floods, then current sea level rise must be something we deserve or something we caused. Either way, the narrative discourages proactive response, suggesting that environmental catastrophes reflect either divine will or human sin rather than systems requiring structural change. The flood story's most insidious psychological legacy may be how it normalizes apocalyptic thinking. When destruction is framed as divine cleansing rather than tragic loss, it becomes easier to anticipate, even welcome, the end of the world. Throughout history, groups have positioned themselves as the metaphorical ark builders, preparing for imminent divine judgment while viewing the potential destruction of others with disturbing equanimity. This apocalyptic framework has fueled everything from doomsday cults to climate inaction. Why save a world that God might choose to destroy? For the modern reader, the flood narrative presents an unavoidable question. If we reject the morality of the flood, the drowning of the innocent alongside the guilty, must we also reject the moral authority of the deity who commanded it? Or can we interpret this ancient story as reflecting human understanding of divine will rather than divine will itself? Can we separate the ethical core of religious traditions from their apocalyptic elements? Perhaps the most responsible approach is to read the flood not as divine history but as human warning, a psychological projection of our own destructive capacities onto the divine. In an era when humanity possesses the technological capacity for self-extinction, perhaps the flood story's true relevance lies not in what it tells us about God's wrath, but in what it reveals about our own. The waters that threaten us now rise not from divine decree but from human choices, and unlike Noah, we cannot build arks to escape the consequences of our collective actions. The flood narrative ultimately confronts us with the most profound moral question. What responsibility do we bear for our survival when others perish? In a world of increasing inequality and environmental devastation, are we Noah, building private salvation while the waters rise around us? Or can we imagine a different story, one where divine mercy extends to all creation, where survival is not the privilege of the few but the birthright of the many, and where righteousness is measured not by who builds the biggest ark but by who works to keep the waters from rising in the first place?